Alright, guys, welcome to the tournament edition of The Floor is Yours. Today we have, for our first round, we have 5 teams with us. We have the teams who call themselves Sun Devil Debate, Dialect Duos, DPSM, the Common Sense Crusaders, as well as a very straightforward team name, Yash and Nitisha, and the Common Sense Crusaders. Keeping that in mind, I would also like to mention that for this tournament, we are working with Project Suffer, a social student run initiative that we are working with and raising money for to bring stranded immigrants back home. So far, they've transported over 163 immigrants back home, and they are intending to transport at least 150 more by the end of this very month, and we are accepting donations that will be mentioned later on Paytm, Google Pay, and a direct bank transfer. And any amount of support from all of you watching and through our participants would be appreciated in any way possible. Keeping that in mind, to introduce the participants from Sun Devil Debate, it's Nanda Gopa Naramisan and Prithviraj Jhunjhunwala. From the Dialect Duos, it's Gaurav Rampuria and Achintya Nevatia. From DPSM, it's Arth Agarwal and Vidyut Chattopadhyay. From the Common Sense Crusaders, there's Ainish Dutt and Shrijan Bhattacharjee. And finally, from Yash and Nitisha, Yash Varma and Itisha. So, keeping that in mind, we would now be. I would remind the speakers that each speaker has 4 minutes to speak. One speaker from each duo is proposing the motion and opposing the motion. And the motion for today's debate is right. So the motion for today's debate is this house believes that the freedom of speech should be granted to the citizens of a country should be absolute. And all of our speakers are prepared to debate on it. And we would be beginning with the dialect duo, wherein we will take the first speaker of the proposition. So for the dialect duo, I would request you to please identify your proposition speaker.
It's Gaurav Rampuria.
Right. That in mind, Gaurav, you have 4 minutes to speak. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. I'm audible, right?
Yes, you are. So
Yeah.
keeping that in mind, for our very first speaker, Gaurav, you have the floor.
Now, a very good afternoon to all members of the House. The motion before us today reads that this House believes that the freedom of speech granted to the citizens of a country should be absolute, and I, as a member of the proposition, firmly support this motion. Now, for the benefit of the House, let me define some key terms in this motion. Firstly, freedom of speech, which is basically the right of the citizens of a country to express their opinions, without censorship or restraint. Now, members of the House understand that freedom of speech is a fundamental right of all human beings. Article 19, Clause 1 of the Indian Constitution guarantees us this freedom of speech and expression under certain restrictions. But if we curtail or restrict this, right, then we are going against the very concept, the very principle of democracy itself. Because a democracy is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And if we are not allowing the people to be properly expressed, if we are taking away their their absolute right to express themselves and their opinions, then and if the voice of the people can't be heard, then a democracy can never be successful. Now, it is our ability to express our opinions, our concerns, and to speak freely that has brought about such changes in our human society and has allowed for the success of our human race. Now, the second key term in this motion is absolute. That is something that which basically means something that is not qualified or diminished in any way. Now, the opposition today, members of the House, is going to come up here and say that complete and absolute freedom of speech will enable people to hurt others' feelings to hurt others' feelings through the usage of their speech without any restrictions. but you cannot have a person's speech and his creative freedom being suppressed within certain parameters and certain restrictions under the consideration that it may hurt someone. Because firstly, there is no legal definition of hurt, and secondly, a person can always exercise his freedom of choice and not engage in a particular situation or engage with particular persons who he feels are insulting them. Now, members of the House, the restrictions that have been imposed by the Constitution of India on freedom of speech is not being applied uniformly. Certain people are able to exercise the freedom of speech to full extent, while certain people are not being able to express themselves at all. And as a result, not everyone is getting the universal the universal right of freedom of speech. Now, let's take the example of the press itself. Despite the legal provisions of Article 19, Clause 1, India was ranked 133rd out of 180 countries in the 2016 World Press Freedom Index by Reporters Without Borders. Now, this just shows how the press of a country is not free to express its views. It's not free to criticize certain actions of the government. It's not free to express the views of the. It's not free to express the views of the general public. And if that is the case, and if we are limiting the restrictions, then the development of a society is not going to take place. If the now If the government makes ads on if the government makes an ad wherein they make communal statements in order to get votes in the vote bank, the press members usually are not able to express their views on it, because if they try to express their views and if they try to criticize the government a lot for such actions, then it is seen as offensive, and it is often restricted. Now, if we take a look at the feminist theory as well and how it came to the limelight, it came to the limelight through writings, through art, through speeches, and that is the mode that we people have of expressing ourselves. Earlier, such modes of expression would usually be shunned down upon. But if our freedom of speech is made absolute, if we are allowed to express whatever we want, then more such societal changes will spring up. In conclusion, when we consider how important freedom of speech is and how fundamental it is to our existence, and how important and significant it is for us to express our opinions, and how societal changes can stem from,
Wrap up, please.
yeah, it makes no sense to have restrictions imposed as the roadblock to slow down our progress and development. Thank you.
Right, keeping that in mind. Thank you, Gaurav. That was a very strong speech you made. Keeping your speech in mind, we would now move forward to your teammate, who is the first speaker of the opposition, which is Achintya Nevatia, who is also one who has debated with us before. So Achintya, are you ready?
Yeah.
Right.
Can I go ahead?
Yeah, you're audible. You have
Yeah.
2 minutes. The floor is yours.
Okay. So the Supreme Court of the United States of America had already declared in the case Skank versus the United States in 1919 that individuals are not entitled to speech that presents a clear and present danger to society, and that's applicable even today. Good afternoon to all. And the motion today states that the House believes that the freedom of speech granted to the citizens of a country should be absolute. And I, as a principal speaker of the opposition, seek to convince you otherwise. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the motion has absolutely failed to address the difference between excessive restriction and normal restriction of the freedom of speech and expression. I do not put forward the idea of excessive restrictions on the freedom of speech and expression, but the whole point of having some restriction on the right was to maintain undisturbed peace and harmony, which is as important as upholding the ideals of democracy. History has served enough testimony to the fact that when any power gets absolute or becomes unchecked, there will be misuse, and it has been proven multiple times. Any absolute right will further lead to violence. You might ask how. Consider this. Since the people are already unchecked and have the free pass of the absolute freedom of speech and expression, there is no guarantee that they will abide by laws and not be violent in their approach while they present their ideas, which by far make sense to them. People should have the right to voice their opinions, but this should not get translated into some kind of misunderstanding that one is free to say anything even if it might lead to the instigation of unrest and disharmony. The unarguable logic being some kind of reasonable restrictions is necessary to avoid the gradual disintegration of harmony in society. Unrestricted speech, for example, in some countries lead to white supremacists or religiously orthodox people to come out and speak, which will surely endanger the stability of a country and lead to violence. Members of the House understand the difference between advocacy and incitement, and speeches like these will serve no purpose but inciting the public, leading to violent riots and crimes. In the hypothetical situation that a country like India allows the absolute freedom of speech and expression to people, people present some radical ideas and intentionally or unintentionally obstruct public services by using their quote unquote absolute freedom of speech and expression. And now another thing that I must draw your attention to is that the constitution and all its laws are indispensable for a country's working, especially in a democracy like India. All the laws of the Indian Constitution and sections under the Indian Penal Code are indisputably linked to each other directly and indirectly. And the right of the freedom of speech and expression is not encompassed only in Article 19 of the Indian Constitution, but is also linked to other laws applicable. When we say that the right to freedom of expression should be absolute, the entire purpose and meaning of the other laws will be substantially changed as well, which will nullify the use of the Constitution itself. And to prove that the freedom of speech and expression is linked to other laws, I must take the example of the court's ruling while discharging bank official Devidas Ramchandra Tuljapurkar, who faced criminal proceedings for carrying in a bank journal a satirical poem centering on Mahatma Gandhi, in which it was alleged obscene language was used. Where he later apologized for the action, which just signifies another need for restrictions. In the context of obscenity, the provision is enshrined under Indian Penal Code Section 292, which is about the sale of obscene books, had its room to play. And therefore, I proudly oppose the motion today. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for your speech, Shantia. You have about 30 seconds remaining. Would you like to carry on, or shall we wrap up?
No, I'm pretty finished here.
Yeah, all right. Keeping that in mind, thank you for keeping it crisp, Cynthia. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the dialect duos, very well versed with their arguments. We would, now that they're over, now that their speeches are over, we would now be taking questions upon first the proposition member and then the opposition member of the duo. Is there anyone with questions towards the proposition speaker, Gaurav Rampuria? Then we would like to move on to our judges, which is Riddhi Panja and Pranav Chaudhary. Do you have any questions to our speaker?
Pranav, do you want to go first?
Riddhi, you go ahead. I'll ask the second question if you have any questions in mind.
Okay. I'll ask the question to the first speaker, Gaurav, I believe. Gaurav, when you say that freedom of speech should be granted to all citizens in an absolute fashion, what about laws like defamation, which are prevalent in almost every country and are used to safeguard the interests of other citizens?
Ma'am, what I mentioned was all citizens should have the right to express themselves. If a particular community of citizens, if they're not being able to express themselves properly through this absolute freedom of speech, they'll be able to express themselves. Alongside that, if they're not properly represented, if they're not properly expressed, then the government needs to take actions to ensure that whatever their demand is properly expressed.
Right. Does that answer your question, Riddhi?
Not really. Can I have a follow-up?
Yeah,
Sure. All right, Gaurav. So the moment, so you mentioned that the government can look into what the person is saying. Isn't that essentially taking away absolute freedom of speech?
I mentioned that the government should try to ensure that whatever they're trying to speak, whatever they're trying to express, if it is not being expressed properly, if it is not being heard by others properly, then the government can help to ensure that whatever they're speaking, it is expressed to others as well.
Okay, all right.
Right. With that, thank you, Riddhi, for your question, and thank you, Gaurav, for the answer. Pranav, do you have a question?
Basically, Riddhi covered the gist of the defamation thing which I was about to ask. So I think we can go on to the next.
Right. And to those from the audience asking me privately, yes, we will have questions from the spectators, but at the very end. Right. Keeping that in mind, thank you to the dialect duo. And we will now be moving on to the next duo, which is Sun Devil Debate, wherein we will now be starting with their proposition speaker.
Wait, one sec, Suryansh.
Right.
There's separate marks for both people, for Gaurav and Achintya, in the rebuttal, in the scope of rebuttal. So shouldn't Achintya get a question as well?
Right. Yes. Apologies. My bad. I crossed over Chinti on accident. My apologies. Right. That in mind, yes, we would now be taking questions on a Chintia speech. I apologize for my falter. Thank you, Riddhi. Yes. So, is there any participant with a question on a Chintia speech?
Yeah, I have a question to Ajintya's speech.
Yes. Arth, you may go ahead.
Yeah. So the speaker talked about the idea of obscenity in question and how the content of a particular poem was obscene. However, obscenity is very subjective. What might be obscene to someone and might not be obscene to everyone, right? And the public policy designing and the interpretation in public policy codes, it is done in a very different way. So how does the speaker want to tackle the subjectivity of such ideas which are present in society with regard to what is moral, with regard to what is immoral, with regard to what is obscene and what is not? That's it.
May I go ahead and answer the question?
Yeah. Sure.
Sir, so basically, when I took the example, I did it to prove my point when I said that the freedom of speech and expression is not standalone law. It is not limited to the Article 19 of the Indian Constitution. It's also linked directly or indirectly to other laws as well. And when and I may have I may have missed to elaborate, but that poem itself was published on public platforms where it was some obscene language was used about Mahatma Gandhi, and of course he's the father of the nation, and spreading that is of course a moment is spreading disharmony in the society on grounds that when you question the goals of the father of the nation itself, aren't you questioning the nation's constitution? And even the nation's constitutions had a part of the directive principles of Gandhian principles as well.
Right. Keeping that in mind, yes. Thank you for your answer, Chintia. Thank you for your question, Art. I would request all participants to please keep their cameras on. And that in mind, we would now move on to the judges. Riddhi and Pranav, do you have a question on what Achintya had to say?
I don't have a question.
Right. We can take one more question. Ainish, you want?
All right. This question is based on the speaker's answer to Art's question. He said that by defining obscenity as subjective, you're going against what the standards of obscenity described by the Constitution. You have to understand, and he's going against it. Doesn't the right to freedom of speech allow you to question fallacies in the Constitution itself?
Sir, I don't think that the poem was in the form of a question when it was given on public platforms. I don't think, sir, there's a difference between passing a statement or giving or questioning the fallacies of the Indian Constitution. And when I stated the example, I stated that the poem clearly used obscene language about Mahatma Gandhi, and that's the point that I'm trying to prove here.
Right. Hopefully that answers your question, Anish. And yes, thank you for the question, and thank you.
Riyansh, I had a question about procedure. Like,
yes, go ahead.
will we be allowed to question a speaker on the statement, like on the answer to another question?
It is up to you, but ideally it should be on the speech. But if you want to question him on that, the judges will be marking you on each question, so they will keep that into account.
Okay.
So keeping that in mind, thank you, Achintya, and thank you to the rest of the dialect duo. We will now be moving on again to the speakers of the Sun Devil debate team. We will be starting with their proposition speaker, who I believe is Nandagopa or Prithviraj. I'm sorry.
It's me, Prithviraj.
Right. Yes. So Prithviraj Jhunjhunwala is the first is the speaker of the proposition from the second team speaking Sun Devil debate. Prithviraj, you have 4 minutes for your speech. Are you ready?
Yes.
Right. Well, you may begin.
Good afternoon, respected judges and the members of the House. Today, we have the motion that this House believes that the freedom of speech granted to the citizens of a country should be absolute. Now, let me start off by defining freedom. Freedom means that there is nothing restricting something, and it's completely independent, and there is nothing which actually curtails or actually restricts something. And now, when we do not keep freedom of speech as an absolute right, that means that we are putting some restrictions to that, which is actually refuting the whole thing which is freedom of speech. Freedom of speech means someone should be allowed to say whatever they want and however they want, and should be allowed to express themselves. This can only be done when freedom of speech is kept absolute. Now, freedom of express, and understand that humans are the only way that they can express themselves is through speech, and through what they say. And when we restrict that, then we have to understand that we actually restrict we restrict their whole opinion. And if we don't have freedom of speech as an absolute right, we then many people might be suppressed, or even be even this even like might not even like their opinions might not even be emphasized upon. Now, understand that when we talk about freedom of speech, it also freedom when we talk about giving making freedom of speech as an absolute right, we have to understand that it also gives minorities a voice. It helps minorities raise their voice, as it's an absolute right and nobody can refute against it. The minority gets more power, and they can also propose their opinions without being restricted. Now, we also have to understand that freedom of speech in its essence is that anybody can do and can say anything without being judged upon, and without actually being actually taken action against, or being punished, so to say. So when we actually restrict some things, and we say that some things cannot be said, we actually stop the whole we remove freedom from the freedom of speech. So that's why I propose the freedom of speech should be absolute, and it should be made absolute. Yes.
Right. Prithviraj, you have about 2 more minutes. Would you like to carry on, or would you like to keep it crisp?
Crisp. I would like to keep it crisp.
Right. Keeping that in mind, thank you, Prithviraj. We will now be moving on to your teammate Nandagopa from the opposition and see what he has to say. So,
All right.
Nandagopa, you have 4 minutes on the clock. Like Prithviraj,
Okay.
are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Right. You may begin.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have to understand is that I would like to explain the fact that the freedom of speech should not be absolute. It is the thing is that when freedom of speech is made absolute, and when it is enforced, it will become some destructive force or a destructive idea to a society. So there are four kinds of equality in a society. There are four kinds of equality in total: political equality, social equality, equality in opportunity, and equality in outcome. So on the outside, it may look like the freedom of speech ensures political equality among the people and among media, in fact, because it could ultimately express a multitudinal, it could express that people could express multitudinal ideas or beliefs about a certain issue, or a certain topic. But then the thing is that what we have to understand is that when there is absolute freedom of speech, there is also a problem that follows this. The fact is that the majority can gain more power over a minority, because the majority and minority will have equal rights to express their own opinions. A majority which has a destructive opinion or a destructive policy will be reflected in a country's own policy. This is because a democracy has four main pillars: legislature, judiciary, and media. So the thing is, in a democracy, all the four pillars should have equal power. When there is imbalance in a democracy, the policy of a country turns destructive. And an absolute freedom of speech ultimately gives media most of the power in a country. This is because we are saying that the media will be an independent body to the government. As such, the media can portray any of its beliefs that it wants. Now, the thing is that when talking about freedom of speech, it does not mean that the government should apply biased views on a certain subject. It does not mean that a government should enforce should restrict certain views in the media. It only means that the government prevents extremism, or the government prevents uh, hate speech, or destructive ideas from surfacing. Now, destructive may be subjective. Now, hate may also be subjective. Legislature is something that us humans have made for our society, and as such, even though hate is not mentioned in the legislature, and another member has stated that hate is not part of the legislature. As such, it cannot be taken into account. Hate may not be part of the legislature, but then hate has what has shaped our country. As such, you cannot take that, not put that out. You have to take that into account when talking about establishing absolute freedom of speech, because it means that all the people, most people, have right to express hate against someone, and there will be very little or no repercussions against them. An absolute freedom of speech is not an it does not mean an ideal society. Even though the Indian Constitution, Article 19 of the Indian Constitution, ensures freedom of speech, it does mention that it is not an absolute right. As such, even you can take the example of India itself. Even though it is not an absolute right, the media in India has multitudinal views about the government itself. There are many media that are for government and against government. As such, you can have all the things that come from absolute freedom of speech, while not having it as an absolute right. That does not mean that the government indoctrinates the people. That's the difference between indoctrination and media, because that does not mean that the government influences the media and influence the views of the people. There are multiple examples of nations
Wrap up.
which do not have an absolute freedom of speech, but still have freedom to express their views, multitudinal views, and also the freedom to argue their views logically, while not making it a destructive idea or a destructive force.
Right, keeping
Thank
it
you.
in mind. Thank you, Nandagopa, and that wraps it for the speeches of the Sun Devil debate team. A very well structured speech by both members. And with that, we would now be moving on towards questions from the participants on their speeches. And anyone with a question, you may respond. Right, Gaurav.
I have a question to the opposition.
Right, you may go ahead.
So I have two questions. Can I ask both of them? Like,
No, I would request you actually. I would request you to address one of them. One of them at first, and if we have time for more, we'll recognize that one.
sure. So basically, the opposition speaker mentioned that if the freedom of speech is made absolute, then the majority will have more power than the minority. But sir, isn't that the very fundamental concept of democracy, that the people who have that the majority, that the people who are in more consensus, they should get the power and they should be represented? Isn't that the very fundamental of democracy?
Sir, I'm stating that when the thing is that there are multiple ways to look at this. The thing is that he has right. I mentioned that
Is he
the
lagging only
media
for me?
overloads all the other pillars. Then
Right, Nandagopa, could you please repeat
Suryansh,
your
could you?
answer? We faced some static.
Yeah, it's all right. It's all right.
Yeah.
So the thing is that as I mentioned, there are multiple pillars in a democracy. If the media gets more power than the others, then the policy and if the majority of the population have a destructive point of view or a destructive policy, that can reflect in a country's or the action that a country itself takes. Now, as I mentioned, the thing is that I'm arguing that the freedom of speech, it does not have to be an absolute right. As stated in Article 19, it mentions that it's not an absolute right. As such, even though it mentions that, India still has multitudinal views. It has multiple views on the government itself, and minority are also a lot of minority. Even they are like many stages. Like there are many different organizations that are allowed to exist in India, which give voices to minority. So all the good that can exist when you have an absolute speech can also exist when you don't have it as an absolute right, but have it
Right.
as an idea
Nandagopa,
that is
I would
yeah.
request you to wrap it up.
I
Yeah.
Yeah,
have another question. Can I ask that?
yeah, fine.
No, let's
Wait,
see what the rest of the speakers have, and then we'll come back to you if
okay,
needed.
fine.
Sure.
Right. That in mind,
Just a
is there anyone?
second.
Yes, Riddhi?
Is there some kind of a cap on how long you can take to answer a question?
Uh,
And if so, can
we
we
we didn't have a cap set for the questions this time, but we will set a cap now for about a minute. You have a maximum a minute to answer each question and 30 seconds to put forward your question. Right. That in mind, is there anyone else with a question to the Sun Devil debate team? Yes, Yash.
Sir, I have a question for Prithviraj.
Yes, go ahead.
Uh, so just a second. Sir, my question is lies that in your speech you clearly mentioned that the powers that are vested in, well, according to your speech, I would like to ask that question. Sorry. In your speech, in your speech it is mentioned that powers of the prime minister freedom of speech should be given, but keeping in mind that the home minister's recent statement that people should push the button so hard that the shock is felt in Shashin Bagh across the threshold beyond which way it is, which we say is unacceptable, or should we learn to be okay with it? Sir, can you please answer my question?
Sorry, but I think his voice lagged for me. Could you please
Right.
repeat it?
Could you please repeat it, but just precipitate it a bit?
Sir, in your speech, according to your speech, my question is that, uh, like the powers vested in the home ministers, uh, and your consent view on how the freedom of speech should be absolute, keeping in mind what home minister recent statement said us, that we should said the people that we should push the button so hard that the shock is felt in Shashin Bagh. Does it cross a threshold beyond which way this is unacceptable, or should we learn to be okay with it? Can you please answer my question?
Understand now, when we say that freedom of speech shouldn't be absolute, we are actually taking away the word freedom from it, as I also mentioned in my speech. And now, as we say, we cannot actually just, when we're focusing on such a wide topic which actually includes many countries, we cannot just abide by one home minister. And we have to understand that there are many different countries and many different things which have to take care of, and not only one home minister's statement which we can consider.
Right. Fair enough. That is his belief. That in mind, we would take one more question from the participants to the Sun Devil debate team and move on to the judges. Is there anyone else? Right. Then we'll take your question, Gaurav. Yeah, go ahead.
So the question is to the opposition speaker. So both in his speech and in his answer to my question as well, he mentioned how the media's like that there are multitude of media views towards the government, and the media has a lot of freedom in our country. But sir, according to the but sir, according but sir, I mentioned a fact in my speech where it said that India is ranked 133rd out of 180 countries in the 2016 World Press Freedom Index. So how does it justify a statement that the media has a lot of freedom in our country?
Sir, understand that not only India, but then also United States of America does not ensure freedom of right as freedom of speech as an absolute right. So you can see that in India, you yourself, like each and every citizen of India can see in media, can see in the internet, can see in television, that multiple different media sources give multiple different views of a single event that government conducts. So everything from the CAA, NRC to every single action that the government does is critiqued by the media. It's critiqued by the media, whether for or against. It's critiqued by the media. So when the freedom of speech that exists, when then a person can form a proper view about the government, that because a person can form a proper view about the government. And also another thing that I would like to address is that the freedom of another thing that I would like to address is that the belief of a person also comes under educational system. So I would not like it goes to a wholly different topic. But then to sum it up, I would like to say that the freedom of speech is still maintained in India, even if the absolute freedom of speech is not, even if it's not an absolute right. Each and every person of India can form their own opinion, whether for or against the government, whether for or against a certain person, whether for or against a certain issue or an event. So when the freedom of speech exists in India, what is the need for an absolute freedom of speech, which is destructive and which can cause hate crimes and xenophobia and racism against a certain group of people?
Right. With that, thank you, Nandagopa. I would remind all the speakers to please keep the questions and the answers as short as possible. And keeping that in mind, we will now be a bit more stricter in enforcing the 1 minute cap. So judges, do take note of how long they exceed their time by. Keeping that in mind, we have now passed the speeches for the Sun Devil debate team. So thank you to them, and we will now move on to DPSM, represented by Vidyut Chattopadhyay and Arth Agarwal. So who will be? So you can please identify your proposition speaker, DPSM.
Yeah, hello. So am I audible?
Yes, you are. Arth, I assume you are the proposition speaker.
Yeah.
Right. So Arth Agarwal, returning to our debate again, is the proposition speaker. Arth, you have 4 minutes on the clock, and yeah, the floor is yours.
Yeah. A very good afternoon to one and all. Now, when we talk about the whole idea of freedom of speech and the absolute nature of delivering the freedom of speech, what we must understand from a democratic scenario, when we talk about granting absolute freedom of speech, it is not a lookout of the government, honestly, because when we give the power to the government to regulate on your speech, that is the first step you take to build a roadmap to lose your voice. Instead of putting a regulation on your voice, they misuse their powers, which will in turn make you lose your voice. And that is not only the scenario which tells us, it is legal precedent. We want to understand that the whole idea of speech is not just black and white. It also includes certain concepts like telephone tapping. It includes publication, which creates a pressure on a person to think that their idea is not up to the standards what the government is upholding. For example, in the Hamwar Dalhalka versus the Union of India case, under the Objectionable Advertisements Act, there was a verdict exercised by the Supreme Court which showed that an advertisement is only for commerce and trade and not for ideas, which clearly shows that the government is already doing its duty of misusing the whole idea of giving speech to you. Your speech is yours, not the government's, and democracy is about what I want and not about what I should get. When we talk about the whole opposition argument of hate speech, what we must understand is here is somewhere where we draw the line between morality and legality, and how the idea of morality is very, very subjective. Because when we talk about public policy courts or open courts, we must understand that whole public policy design on considering something to be moral or immoral is very, very subjective. Therefore, it is what to say, it is a pillar, or it is an objection in the whole process of granting freedom of speech, which will in turn make you lose your democratic rights and your human rights in your country. And it is the first step to draw the roadmap for fascism, which is very, very dangerous. Now, when we talk about the whole idea of politics and activism and the whole association of politics and activism with freedom of speech, what we must understand is that in countries like India, certain aged people think that whoever is involved in politics or whoever is involved in advocacy or activism, it is not something which is open for public discussion, or it is often deemed to be controversial. Why? Because the government has made you believe that politics is controversial. But ladies and gentlemen, politics is every newspaper I read, politics is the bread I eat, politics is every book I read. Therefore, there should be no such case where we deem politics to be controversial in a public surrounding, which the government has made you believe to think. Ask yourself, when you make a statement, what are you fearing? Are you fearing to offend a person, or are you fearing to offend the government? When we talk about the whole idea of protests, in India only, Kanhaiya Kumar has been arrested a lot of times, all right. And when we talk about such arrests, what we must understand is they have no grounds and they misuse the power, which is why we shouldn't allow the government to do something which is not, what to say, which is not uh, which will not make people arrest for shouting azadi in front of colleges. It will not make the police do lathi charge for shouting azadi in front of institutions, because it is important to think for yourself. It is important to question authority, and when we give the authority to the government, we will have no authority to question, because they will not give you a mouth to question, they will shut it up. Why? Because you are giving them the power to do so. And it is very, very important that we understand that we do not go from a democracy to a fascism transition in the 21st century, because that is,
To wrap up.
yeah, because that is not the current idea of how human rights should function in this world. And since we talk about the whole TV shows idea, political idea,
Please, Raghav.
satire being used in comedy shows in India that does not exist. Why? Because the surrounding and the stigmatization of public policy changes, the whole idea of moral policy changes when you put a ban or when you do not put a ban, but when you show that you want to put a ban. And with that is the exact case in India. I would like to end my speech here. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Arth. A very heartfelt speech you made. We thank you for it. And with that, we would now move on to his teammate and see what he has to offer to this debate in the shape of Vidyut Chattopadhyay. Vidyut, we have 4 minutes for you too. Are you ready?
All right.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. Go ahead.
There is an African American man who is filming me and threatening me and my dog. These were the words of Amy Cooper, a white woman, to the 911 operator. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Vidya Chattopadhyay, and I'm speaking against the motion that freedom of speech granted to the citizens of country should be absolute. Now, let me try and clear this up at the beginning of my speech. I do not argue that freedom of speech is not the most fundamental. I do not contend that. I do not contest against it that freedom of speech is a fundamental right. It definitely is. People should have the freedom of speech. But what we need to understand is that there is a necessity for limitations. What the proposition has done is that they have interpreted the motion that has been given to an extreme case, that all of the restrictions that would be imposed will lead to chaos, anarchy, misuse, abuse. I urge the members to understand the situation. Let me try and give you an example. Let's say you're sitting in a movie theater and somebody screams and says, there is a fire, there is a bomb, when there is none. Understand the power the words hold. Understand the implications of the words. Understand how these words can incite panic. Understand why, because of this, because of the panic that it can cause, you cannot say this legally. It is a punishable offense to do something like this. What we also need to understand is that when we say that freedom of speech should be absolute, you are opening up the gateway to use freedom of speech. You're abusing freedom of speech. What we need to understand is that whenever people say that I have the freedom of speech to say anything and whatever I want, you're using your freedom of speech to defend yourself against the social implications or the social repercussions of the words that you have said. It is like saying freedom of speech is being used as the words no offense before saying something offensive. That is the crux of the entire situation. We are not arguing for the complete removal of the freedom of speech, but we are simply saying that people should understand what their words mean and the effects that those words carry. And here is why it is important to have legal boundaries or restrictions, because right now, with the advent of social media and everything, while it has, I will admit, they have its benefits, but what we need to understand, because there is such a huge platform for people to voice their opinions however they want to, we see that there is an increase in amount of online harassment, there is an increase in bullying, there is an increase in hate speech. Now, what we have to understand is that hate speech is very important here in this debate, because hate speech against certain communities, against certain minorities, when it reaches a certain extent and convinces people that a group of people are essentially a threat to them, you incite violence, you incite rage, you incite riot, you incite hostilities. Again, I will reiterate, understand the power of your words. Now, let me go back to my initial quote of what Amy Cooper has said. In a discourse, in a interaction between a black male and a white woman, where there was no threat, Amy Cooper told the 911 operator that there was a black man threatening her. She knew the power of those words. She knew how this false information could threaten the black individual, because she knew for a fact that the black individual would be scared of the police and would leave her alone. So she was free to do so. She was free to say whatever she wanted to the 911 operator. She had the right to do so. But the implications of those words are humongous. The power she held by just saying that there is a black man threatening me is humongous. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, we have to understand that restrictions are of prime importance. Let me give you another example. There was a person named
Vidyut,
Justin
wrap up.
Carter. All right, just this would be my final point. Justin Carter, a gamer playing League of Legends, he made a comment saying that he would shoot up a kindergarten school and eat pistol beating hearts. LOL JK. Now, not say the least, he was arrested for the charge of terroristic threats. Of course, he would be, because each word has meaning, each word have power, each word has consequences. That would be my speech. I rest my case, but not my stance.
Thank you, Vidyut. Another very well structured speech over the misuse of the power of speech and why he stands why he stands in the opposition to this motion. Thank you, Vidyut, and thank you, Art. That was both speakers of DPSM. And that in mind, we would now be entertaining questions over this duo's speeches. We would now take questions from the participants. You can notify me of right. I believe Nanda Gopa has a question. Nanda Gopa.
Yeah. So I would like to address this question to the proposition. So the proposition stated that the government, when you give the government the power to dictate what each person says, then it is the first step to fascism. So I would like to address something. In a democracy where each and every person has the power to elect the person leading them, where is the question? Where is the question that the government will misuse the power and will misuse the power to hurt the people, because the people are the one who are electing the person leading them. So in a democracy, how can it be that a government will misuse the power that it gives?
Right. Arth, you were the proposition speaker. Are you with us?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I would request you, to address this question.
Yeah, so I'm like really sorry, but can the question be repeated?
Right. Arth has some net issues, Nanda Gopal. Can you please address your question to him once again? Keep it crisp.
All right. In a democracy where each and every person has the power to elect their head, why is there a question of whether the government will misuse that power to and hurt the people who are the ones who actually support the person leading? Or rather, in democracy, where is the question that the government will misuse its power?
A very simple answer to that. I'll not keep it long. The government can do that because it has been done in the past. That's it. If that is satisfactory.
Right. Hopefully it is, Nanda Gopal. And thank you, Arth. We will now be moving on to another question from the participants and then move on to the judges. Is there any question from the participants? That's impressive, DPSM. We would now be moving towards the judges. Pranav, Riddhi, do either of you have a question?
Yeah, I do have a question towards Art, and I would like to go first, Pranav, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's
Art,
perfect.
you talked about morality and immorality and how subjectivity could lead to is the reason why everyone should be equally in the same capacity be given the absolute right to freedom of speech. So, are you agreeing to the fact that the capacity of freedom of speech should be the same for a KKK member as it is for a black person in the USA? Uh, or likewise, do you think that a Savarna Brahmin entitled Islamophobic man should have the same freedom of speech as an oppressed Muslim in India? Do you believe that hate speech should have the same platform and absolute freedom as a minority empowering themselves?
Definitely. To answer to that question, I would like to say, then again, we have to draw the moral legal line here, including that as legality is something which I am not a fan of, because I fear that my government can misuse it on the other way around, which is the other side of the coin. Now, when I say that, when you talk about how an Islamophobic man or a Savarna man or uh, a man who has racist, homophobic, Islamophobic opinions stands and gives them, definitely that is wrong. And for that, that is morally wrong. And to include the idea of legal actions then and there is not something which should be delivered. And even if it is delivered, I'd like to cite a case here. For example, certain advertisements of drugs or alcohol in many countries around the world have had certain ideas, right, which have been cleared down due to lack of public policy interpretation in public policy courts. And especially certain public policy courts are not, I do not have enough trust on the public policy courts or the government to deliver the law, to deliver deliver justice in an efficient way, which will make me feel assured that the legal system of my country wouldn't be used in a way where my speech wouldn't be suppressed.
All right.
Therefore, I would like to negate that aspect of the argument here, because everything has pros and cons. It is just that I believe that one side of the coin outweighs the other. That's it.
Right.
Just one small follow-up.
Right.
Suryansh,
Right. Fair enough.
yeah, this is just a yes or no question. I understand what you're talking about, but at the same time, do you believe in suppressing hate speech or not? Because you've talked about how the government could go against the other side. The base question here is, do you believe in suppressing hate speech?
Definitely, public support. That's my answer, because I do not trust the legal system, but I trust my people. The people are capable of doing that, and that is what they do. Social media call out.
Fair enough, Earth. We see where your faith lies and where it doesn't too. So that in mind, thank you, Earth, and thank you, Vidyut. That wraps up DPSM's speeches. To these speakers.
Was there a question to? I'm sorry for interrupting. Was there a question to the opposition here?
I don't think a question was put forward towards the
I think it would be only fair if there was a question to the opposition.
Right. I don't think anyone wanted to ask one, but anyhow, is there anyone who wants
or do you want to do it after the?
No, Pranav, you ask a question. Suryan just messed with it by mistake. So let's. Do you have a question for him?
I'm sorry. This is about a question to Vidyut, right? The member of the opposition. Yeah. So I do have a question, and it was long. So, but I think we'll have to go ahead with that. So, Vidyut, are you here?
I am here.
Yes. So, my question to you is a little bit long. Please pay attention to what I'm saying. My question is that when you talk about there being a certain restrictions to the absolute freedom of expression, which are essential for the freedom even existing in the first place, are you meaning to imply that certain restrictions which make the right to freedom of expression viable or existing in the first place are not, for example, if there are certain restrictions imposed on the right to freedom of speech which are essential for that right to exist in the first place, you consider these restrictions to be a kind of a barricade to the freedom of expression, or do you consider them to be disciplines that come along with the freedom itself?
All right. So first, I'd like to say is that when we that have been certain restrictions that have been implemented across freedom of speech in, let's say, a certain country, and it has been seen repeatedly these restrictions have led to barricading people expressing their feelings or expressing views against the government or misuse of this restriction. What we need to understand here is that my contention isn't on how the restriction should be used. It's about the fact whether restriction should be used. It is the principle that restrictions have to be used. Now, my second point would be that if, let's say, restrictions are having such negative impacts on the freedom of speech, it talks a lot more about the application or the implementation of these restrictions rather than the restrictions themselves. It is how they're used versus what they are.
No, Vidyut, I get your point. But Suryansh, do you have a time for a follow-up? Because I don't think you could interpret my question correctly.
Right. I would request you, because we are at a time constraint, I would request you to keep it precipitated. But yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so Vidyut, I got the point you were trying to make. So let me explain to you my question with an example. If a person say outrages the modesty of a woman by using his right to freedom of speech, then you are say basically arguing that this should not be the case, and therefore there are certain restrictions that need to be imposed so that this does not happen. Do you mean to? I mean, do you mean to argue that when a person gets the right to speak, then does the discipline of not misusing that right to outrage the modesty of a woman automatically come when the person gets that right, or do you consider it necessary to be a restriction to the right to freedom of speech that is granted to the person?
Right now, when we are seeing that there has been excessive freedom that has been given to people, there has been excessive use of freedom of speech. And that's why you have to understand that this isn't something that comes inherently to a person. It doesn't come inherently to the person to understand where the border lies. That is why the restrictions themselves are required in the first place. But like what you're saying, that it should be an inherent quality that should come along with the freedom of speech, that simply isn't working. We have seen this in the United States. We have seen it in India. We have seen how the use of freedom of speech is being abused. And these restrictions themselves that I am contending for themselves aren't there. Without them, this is the result. Hate speech against ethnic minorities. This is the result that we are getting. That's why the restrictions are important.
Right. Thank you, Vidyut. I think that would answer your question, Pranav. Keeping that in mind, thank you, DPSM. I think the judges have a lot on their plate for the next team now. So we would now be moving forward with the next team, which is the Common Sense Crusaders, represented by Ainish Dutt and Srijan Bhattacharjee. The Common Sense Crusaders, who will be your proposition speaker?
Anish Dutt will be representing said proposition.
Right. Well, you, Anish Dutt, have 4 minutes on the clock. Are you ready?
Sure.
Right, go ahead.
All right. A very warm afternoon, warm greetings conveyed to everyone present here. Understand that nothing in this world is objective. Morality, sedition, oppression, everything in this world is subjective. Now, understand the very concept of restraints, whether they might be reasonable restraints, it's led up to the arbitration of the government. Now, the government in 2011, on the 4th of January, the Tunisian government might have argued that their restrictions on freedom of speech might have been reasonable. But a street vendor by the name of Mohamed Bouzizi, who immolated himself outside parliament, could have complained that they weren't reasonable. And now it is solely up to our interpretation. You have to understand that the second you add a restriction to a freedom, that's when you take the freedom out of it. You edge more towards authoritarianism, and that's when liberty dies. Now, understand that there are certain responsibilities which come with freedom of speech, but it is up to choice. John Milton in his book Areopagita argued that one can choose truth and goodness only when there's knowledge of evil. I cannot praise a fugitive and cloistered virtue, unexercised and unbreathed, that never sallies out her adversary. Confrontation with error, he wrote, essential to the confirmation of truth, and the confrontation depends upon hearing all manner of reason. The second you deem one sort of speech or one thought of speech immoral or against the fabric or against social fabric, that's when you start pushing forward your narrative and position everybody's thinking into a box. Now, in India, our freedom of speech comes with certain restrictions. And now, what these restrictions do is they tell you what you can say and what you can't say. And slowly, you push a narrative into where people are only expected to think along the lines of what the government says. And people argue that if freedom of speech was absolute, then the majority would be able to persecute the minority. On the contrary, I argue that because of freedom of speech isn't absolute, that is the only reason why majoritarian views dictate our daily narratives. Understand that because we live in because of certain restrictions, because now with our present government going out with our present government, testing freedom of speech and twisting it to their narratives. Whenever somebody on the counter tries to use their tries to point it out, that's when they curb it. So they use these so the restrictions come into place only when the arbitrators choose so. Now, freedom of speech should be absolute so that the 51% so that the 51% speech doesn't have a precedence over the 49% speech. The second you have restrictions, the very exists of truth. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. The very existence of these restrictions makes sure that the 51% can say whatever they want by virtue of forming government. But the 49%, by virtue of not forming government or by not winning in parliamentary procedure, have to face restrictions because human beings and no human being thinks the same way. So what might be offensive to me might not be offensive to another person. For example, I can walk down and order beef biryani at any restaurant as so I choose.
Anish,
But
wrap up.
all right, and a patron right next to me might feel that his religious freedom might be violated, and wants this particular item to be taken off. That is an affront to religious freedom and freedom of choice. So the entire balance hangs in the narrative of choice. People have the choice to choose what to say, but the second you begin to arbitrate, that's when free. The second you begin to arbitrate, that's when freedom of speech stops being free.
Right. A very well put and to the point speech made by Anish. Thank you for ending dot on time, as a matter of fact. Uh, Anish, that was Anish Dutt, for the first member of the Common Sense Crusaders. Let's see how much more sense his teammate can bring into his opposition speech. In Srijan Bhattacharjee. Srijan, can you hear us? I was told that he has some internet issues. So just in case, we might move on. Right. I don't think.
May I call him?
Right. We will pause the recording while Anish contacts his teammate. All right. So we're back, and I don't think Shrijan's internet is coming back, but Anish will be contacting him, and if he's back, we will be taking his speech all the way at the very end as the last speech. So Anish, your teammate, will be given a chance at the end, if possible, if he can make it. So in the meantime, we will be taking questions on Inish and Inish's speech only. So to all the participants with a question on Inish's speech, please voice yourself. Yes, I think Nandagopa has a question, as you mentioned. Nandagopa?
Yeah, so he said, so the proposition speaker stated that because the 49 he talked about a 49% because the 49% of the people don't form a government, they can't express their views. The thing is that each and every person has has their own complex belief. So having a more absolute freedom of speech, does it not mean that there is more space for ideological separation, due to which more conflicts can arise?
All right. I would like to, using anecdotal evidence and using real day evidence, I would like to put forward certain views. Right now, a couple of years ago, I'm going to use so. Right now, members believing in a certain saffron ideology by sanctions of the government can put whatever views they choose, and it can't be and it's not classified as hate speech, but for the government they sanction it as freedom of speech. But if someone on the complete opposite side of the religious spectrum quotes the exact same thing but substitutes the words of the parties around, he will be arrested, and this has happened before. Let's say watering it down, we have heard very fiery speeches by BJP members admonishing Muslims and
Wrap it up, please.
but let's say an Islamic cleric was to do the same thing, and who has done pretty similar things, has ended up in prison. So, which is exactly why I say, because this freedom of speech is not absolute, it does not extend to the 49% in the same virtue by which it extends to the 51%. Does that
Right.
satisfy?
Yes, that satisfies me. Hopefully, that satisfies Nandagopal too. Um, and
Priyansh, will
yes,
we be taking a question from the judges?
Sure,
yes, I was
sure,
coming to
sure,
that.
sir.
I am coming to that now. Seeing as there is no other participant, Pranav, yes, you may ask your question.
Okay, right. So my question is as follows. You talked about, just give me a moment. Yes, you talked about how when the government is given a right to impose certain restrictions, then slowly and slowly they push down a narrative in the public's mind, and which results to the public losing some of their own opinion. Now, my question to you is simple: how does your argument contradict the concept of there being restrictions on the freedom of speech? You're talking about the government is misusing their right to impose certain restrictions on the freedom of speech and using that to induce a narrative in the minds of the people. How is that an argument against the concept of a restriction on the freedom of speech existing?
All right. I would like to begin with a quote from one of my favorite dead presidents of the United States of America. When the government fears the people, that's when you have liberty. But when the people fear the government, that's when you have tyranny. So the very existence of these restrictions puts forward a narrative in which the government molds the citizens into thinking along their lines. Had these restrictions not existed, people would have not had the fear of expressing their own opinions. But the very presence of these restrictions pushes citizens into thinking along the same lines and the same narratives as the government wishes to put forward. So the very idea of restrictions eliminates any possibility of people forming their own opinions, whether they might support, or whether they might, especially the fact when they might contradict whatever the government wishes the people to think. So yes, I do. I reaffirm that restrictions take away restrictions. Also, that another downside of restrictions is that it takes away
Wrap it up,
it
please,
waters
Andy.
down opinions into a single state narrative.
Right. That meant thank you, Anish. You have been very frequent with your examples of different narratives, which I felt like pointing out. But anyhow, we would, while hopefully your teammate Shrijan can return and deliver his speech at the very end, I would now be moving on towards the next team for the time being. Yash, which comprises of Yash and Nitisha. So we will start with the proposition speaker from their duo. Uh, I believe Yash was the proposition speaker.
No, I was the proposition speaker. Itisha is the proposition speaker.
Right. My apologies. Itisha, you have 4 minutes on the clock. Are you ready?
Yes, thank you.
You may begin.
People demand freedom of speech to make space for the freedom of thought. Good evening, my dear fellow delegates. Today I'm going to speak for the motion. What do we really mean by freedom of speech? Freedom of speech is the power or right to express one's opinion without the fear of restriction or any legal penalty or censorship. Now, when a lot of social media platforms are used by the government to disclose their policies, and when people put up their criticisms in the comment section, a lot of them are censored or a lot of them are removed. So what we need to understand over here is that there must be some transparency and the government. And when you say someone you can't speak this, you are not only preventing them from speaking, you're also putting their mind in a box and saying that what you are thinking is wrong, and thus their freedom of thought is also violated. And talking about for example YouTube, where a lot of content was taken down recently, for example the Carrie Minati one. In respect of hate speech, we need to understand that the words are really subjective, and there is a fine line between hate and criticism, and we can't really discriminate, or we can't really differentiate what is hate and what is what is criticism. I strongly believe that for more transparency and for people to grow as individuals for the development of these communities, it is very important that freedom of speech is absolute. And thus, I would like to end. Thank you.
Right. Itisha, you have 2 more minutes. Would you like to continue or shall we wrap up?
Wrap up.
Right. So very similar to Prithviraj, Itisha also keeps it crisp. So keeping that in mind, we would now move on to her teammate, which is Yash, who is opposing this motion. Yash, are you with us?
One second, just a second. Am I
Yash?
audible?
Yeah, just a little louder, and can you please keep your camera on so the rest of the speakers.
Delegates and follow observers. Speaking of the motion that we have come into consideration with understanding is that freedom of speech is nothing but freedom without any restriction. And when it is freedom of speech given, there should be restrictions given. That's what people says nowadays. But speaking about that, let's look at what's happening and what people think of the freedom of speech and what misuse they are conducting to it. According to Section 295A of the Indian Penal Code, enacted in 1927, says whoever with deliberate and malicious intention of outraging the religious feelings of any class of citizens uh, by either words spoken or written or by signs or by visible representations or otherwise insults or attempts to insult the religion or the religious beliefs of the class shall be punished with imprisonment of either description for a term which may extend to more than 3 years. Uh, According to Section 153A also of the Indian Penal Code, whoever by words either spoken or written or by signs or by visible representations or otherwise promotes or attempts to promote on grounds of religion, race, place of birth, residence, language, caste or community or any other grounds whatsoever, disharmony or feelings of enmity, hatred or ill will between different religious, racial, language or religion groups or caste or communities, or commits any act which is prejudicial to the maintenance of harmony between different religious, racial, language, or religion groups of caste or communities, and which disturbs or is likely to disturb the public tranquility shall be punished with imprisonment which may extend to 3 years of more. That's 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 the exact reason why the government has put restrictions and people are opposing these laws. Let me give some examples to prove my point why the freedom of speech shall be restricted. Uh, as we all know, some days ago, a college student started blabbering bad things about his college professor and says Azadi. That too came in a complete disappointment towards his professor, and the professor was asked to quit his job. Uh, was asked to quit his job. Another example that I would like to give that why the freedom of speech should be restricted is that which basically clearly every one of us knows is YouTube versus TikTok, in which an Indian YouTuber, I will not take his name because that will be annoying, said annoying things about TikTokers and indirectly roasted them, and harassment was done with the social media, and body shaming was done too, which in way was taken lightly by the people but have attained high humiliation towards those who me criticize in social media, and it clearly proves that the freedom should be restricted until people knows when to talk and when to speak. Thank you. I would like to conclude my statements.
Right. That in mind, thank you, Yash. That wraps it up for both of your speeches, and we would now be taking questions upon both Yash and
Sorry, I
Tisha's.
forgot to put the.
Yeah, no problem. Well, at least you're
Yeah,
back.
I
So, yeah, Vidyut, you had a
I
question.
have a question. I have a question for Itisha. Ma'am, you mentioned that you about YouTube, about how it has now taken down certain content put up by certain people. I'd just like to ask you, since YouTube is a private company and it is the company's right, therefore, to determine whether a content is hateful or not, how reasons stand when it is a private company which can determine whether a content can be hateful or not?
So thank you for the question. I just wanted to mention that the content which the creators are creating, they should be free of whatever they are representing, and not that they should only think in a certain way. They should be open to various content. Thank you.
Right, that mind. I hope that answers your question, Vidyut. And thank you, Isha. That mind. We would now take Prithviraj's question.
So I have a question to Yash. So, in your speech, sir, you mentioned that how speech should be some restrictions put to freedom of speech. But don't you think by putting restrictions to freedom of speech, you're actually basically removing the whole word freedom from freedom of speech, because freedom means that independence and the free will to say something. And when you put restrictions to remove freedom from, how do you justify a statement, sir?
So, first of all, what I meant to say is that we should put restrictions, not completely remove the freedom of speech. And secondly, when you notify what things happened, like in the recent past, the professor has to quit his job when he was not in the wrong. He just scolded at a college student, and because of the attained disappointment that he got from his college student, he has to quit his job. And secondly, the example that I gave about YouTube and TikTok is very well seen. Karim Minati, like I'm taking the name right now. Karim Minati like literally roasted all the YouTubers, and you know what happened to his videos? It was completely removed by YouTube because it was completely against the freedom of speech. That's that too, and that complaint was given. So, sir, restrictions shall be made because the people right now know what is the freedom of speech, but they don't know where to use it and how to use it.
Well, that in mind, we will take one final question from the participants, which we'll take from Ainish because he hasn't asked a question yet. Ainish, go ahead.
Um, Fine. Since I have to ask a question, this is again during the entire speech I had to try connecting with Srijan, so I'll be asking a question solely based on his answers. All right. So you justified placing in restriction. You justified placing restrictions. You justify placing restrictions on freedom of speech for a citizen on the basis that YouTube doesn't do. But you understand that YouTube has a very different terms of service which all content creators have to sign, and violating those terms of service will lead to repugnance. But understand that in India, in the name of restrictions, people's freedom of speech is being violated. So how do you? So could you please try justifying again that these restrictions should be put in place just because YouTube does it? So could you justify why saying because YouTube does it, India must do it as well?
Sir, what I meant to say is that I was just giving an example that the thing that happened was a direct stop on the freedom of speech, and a restriction should be made on it. It doesn't prove that YouTube is doing so we should do it. I'm not supporting that thing, but I'm saying that freedom of speech was there has to be a restriction, because whatever the YouTubers said and the TikTokers said was entirely that they didn't know what to speak and what to speak, and it indirectly created a huge fight between these guys. And that is just an example that I use, that why freedom of speech should be enacted, and not just because
All right.
YouTube deleted a video. We should.
Suryansh, a follow-up.
I would request you not to, but I would allow it if you insist.
I insist.
Fair enough. Go ahead.
All right. And in your penultimate answer, you said that used to justify fascism. So by saying that freedom of speech should be restricted because humans aren't responsible enough, do you justify a big brother state to dictate our speech and every action we do?
So can you please question?
You said in one of your answers, you said that humans cannot responsibly handle freedom of speech and are not responsible creatures. This is the very same line of argumentation which Hegelian idealists, which are basically fascists, use to justify a police state or a fascist big brother state. So using this argument, would you justify that democracy is not needed and now it's the time for the state to look after to watch over each and every part of a step?
I would like to answer that in a very simple question. Yes.
Okay, respect.
Right.
That's brave.
Well, with your respect having been conveyed, we have come to the end of questions from the participants upon this duo speech. Um, we will now be taking a question from the judges if they have one.
I don't have any questions from Raj.
Right. Pranav, do you have a question?
No, it's okay.
Right, fair enough. So that brings us down to one small event left, which is the speech of Shijan. So we will take a quick break and try to connect.
Yeah, now his thing is.
All right. So now that we've spent some time trying to reconnect with Shijan, the only solution we've come to is a rather odd, but it's the best improvisation we could come to. Shijan has sent in an audio of his speech, which will be played by his teammate Ainish, as his Zoom, which we are working on, is not working. So I would now request Ainish to play your teammate Ainish's speech. Go ahead.
A very good evening again to the ladies and gentlemen present here. I am deeply sorry for the inconvenience I've caused. I really am. I really did not mean to, and I'm terribly sorry. Uh, but without any further delay, I would like to go on with my speech. Good evening, everyone. My name is Srijan Bhattacharya, and I would be speaking against the motion, which is that the House believes that the freedom of speech granted to the citizens of a country should be absolute. Now, I would like to begin my speech by recalling something which the first speaker said. He defined freedom of speech as a fundamental right under certain restriction, which I coincide with. But then again, he went on to say that absolute freedom of speech also falls under certain parameters. So the absolute nature of absolute freedom of speech is immediately suppressed and nullified as soon as the speaker mentioned the phrase within the certain restrictions or parameters. Uh, Coming to the second speaker of the proposition of proposition, Prithvi Raj, I think, he defined freedom as something without any restrictions, I suppose. And then and then he went on to cite how freedom of speech gives minorities power to represent themselves to the higher classes of society. So I would like to mention that if freedom meant the abolition of restrictions, then it wouldn't be long before the constitution itself, which you cited in your argument, would fall flat on its face. You're essentially proposing an exchange of unrestricted expression of thought for a semi-anarchist socio-political environment, causing, first of all, it would cause a severe panic and chaos among the masses, and so it also makes the society susceptible to idealists like monopolistic idealists and opportunists, which will obviously inevitably lead to economic crises and economic breakdowns, right? And then it would also, so I would just like to say that it would also mean that like the people who you're trying to defend, that is the minorities, they would suffer the most, right? Because if there are people who are taking advantage of freedom of speech, I know that a lot of people mentioned that how freedom of speech will like is inevitably taken advantage of one way or the other. But if absolute freedom of speech were like if it were to be allowed, then it would obviously give way to a lot, like it would potentially mean the materialization of many like harmful activities which are being suppressed just because of the suppression of freedom of speech. And I'm not saying that freedom of speech is like being suppressed is something good in itself, but wouldn't it result in the exploitation and economic like, it wouldn't it result in the economic exploitation of the minorities you're trying to defend, going by your definition of freedom? And after that, the third speaker, Arth, I believe, he cited some very valid examples of the government suppressing freedom of speech. But so freedom of speech can also be abused to violate the freedom of speech of and train of thought of another individual or group of individuals, right? Like to conclude my argument, I would like to say that I would like to urge everyone to vote for the like morally and legally correct side. Thank you.
Right. Well, that was actually a pinpointed ending to Shijan's speech as I timed it. So I thank him wherever he is for that. So yeah, so the annoying conundrum that we've come to is how we would question him. So the judges will be taking an average of the rest of his scores and taking that into his account for his questions. So that will be taken into account by the judges. We have full confidence in them for that. But in the meantime, we have also asked Ainish the questions he has to be asked. So we have come to the end of uh, end of.
I had an informal question, Suryansh.
Yes, go ahead.
So the thing is, he mentioned that the first speaker stated something which is like he has completely misquoted the first speaker of the proposition.
Right. When it comes to misquotes, I'm completely sure that our judges Riddhi and Pranav, who were also paying attention to the speeches, would have noted that it's not exactly that. So I think they would have taken that into account. But you can point that out to the judges via chat if very necessary. But in the meantime, that we have elapsed all the speeches, questions that were to be asked, and that in mind, we will now conclude with questions from the audience. We have a few members viewing today, so if they can turn on the cameras and voice themselves, that would be excellent. If there is any questions from the audience.
I have a question, but I have poor network. Do I need to turn on my video? Like,
I would encourage you to do so, but if that's not possible, it is okay. But you may introduce yourself and propose your questions to either.
Good afternoon to one and all present here. I am Shubhayu Chakraborty, and my question is to Earth. Is Earth present in committee?
It's not committee, but is Earth here? Is Earth's connection working? I don't think Earth's internet is very stable right now. He isn't here.
Okay, my question goes to Gaurav. He's also a proposition speaker.
Okay, go ahead.
So, what are your comments on the fact that freedom of speech is being used as what are your comments on the fact that freedom of speech is being used as an excuse for spreading hatred, for spreading rumors through their speeches, through their writings? So, what are your comments on it?
So see, the thing is, every concept has a pro and a con. The con, when you are saying that absolute freedom of speech, there will be some more hate speeches being spread. But the thing is, when you look at the broader picture, wherein people will be able to express their views more properly, that is more important to consider right now. That's pretty much what I'm saying.
Right. Keeping that in mind, thank you, Gaurav, and thank you very much, Shubhayu. I hope that does answer your question. If there is there any other member of the audience who would like to ask a question to any of our fine speakers? I repeat, is there anyone else from the audience? Seeing as there are none,
I would like to ask.
Right.
Yes, I'm Ayush Pramanik.
Yeah.
Can I be heard?
Yeah, you can. Ayush. Go ahead.
Yeah. So we are talking about hate speech. We're talking about defamation over here. I get all of that. My question is to the opposition. That is, if there are restrictions, since it's completely arbitrary, I get it that some like when we are talking about homophobic comments or racist comments, some people they don't get to have an opinion about things like this. But when it's arbitrary, it's easy for the people who actually formed the law in the first place to use that to their advantage. So when both sides have a voice, both sides can either choose to refute or debunk an argument placed by the other one, even if it's hate speech. But when we are talking about, we are saying that, no, you can't put up anything of the sort, suppressing hate speech if you're going for an absolute, you're allowing absolute power to.
Ayud, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but could you please precipitate your question? I think it's turning a bit more into a speech.
I'm sorry. So the question is, if if that is the case, then how, when you're talking about hate speech, how do you justify when the fact that the government also can completely use this to their advantage? How is that avoided
Okay,
if
I
it's
would
not
like to
absolute?
answer this question if that's okay.
Sure.
So basically, my contention in my speech was not to argue how these restrictions would be implemented, because that is definitely a difficult topic to discuss, because talking about how the restrictions, but that is not the crux of the debate that we have today. The crux is the principle should be okay or not. That is what the opposition is fighting for. That the restrictions, the principles itself is valid. We are not here to discuss how the restrictions would be imposed or how it may be misused, but it is to be understood that the fact that restrictions are to be there is the crux of the argument.
That answers my question. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Ayud, and thank you, Vidyut, for answering so quick and getting going so quick to the response. So I don't think there's any other spectator who would like to ask a question. Is there anyone else? Yes, I think there is a Vanchit Agarwal who would like to ask a question. Vanchit, I would encourage you to turn on your camera, introduce yourself, and ask your question to whoever you would like to.
I would like to address my question to Yash.
Right, Vanchit, your voice is cracking up. We can't hear you very clearly. Could you repeat?
Audible right now.
Yeah, that's better.
So my question to Yash was, in the beginning of his speech, mentioned that freedom of speech can be just.
I can't hear him properly. I can't hear him
Right.
at all.
Yash, sorry, Vanchit, I am very sorry, but I don't, we have time constraints and I don't think you're very audible. So we would have to go over it once again. I sincerely apologize, but there's nothing we can do about it. But anyhow, with that, we have come to the end of the very first round, very first match of the first stage of the Floor is Yours this tournament edition. And I would like to thank all of you for taking part. And of course, two teams will be moving forward from this. But yes, we are at the very end. And before we move on to the declaration of the results and what the judges have to say, I would once again like to remind you that we are working with Project Suffer, an organization designed towards helping migrant workers get back to their place of homes. Right now, we are all at the comfort of our homes, being able to argue such prevalent topics. However, there are those who are unable to reach their homes, and to those watching and to those taking part, if there is any way, shape, or form that you can help, we are accepting donations throughout the time of this tournament via Google Pay, Paytm, or a direct transfer. So you can feel free to approach us on our Instagram page or contact us on any of the numbers and do provide us with any help for Project Suffer that you can. So with that, I thank everyone for taking part.
Suryansh, I had something to say regarding this.
Yes, Ayud, go ahead.
Yeah. So I have already paid, but I would like to donate some more so I can do it. Like, should I do whatever I just did? I mean, do I pay on the same Paytm number again?
Yeah, that is, and firstly, that's excellent to hear. Ayud, yes, you can pay by any of the three modes that I mentioned, and if you would like to, sure, I would encourage you to go ahead. But yes, you can contact us on the Instagram page, and I can
Okay.
help, I can guide you through that process again. Anyhow, I again we will specify everything on the YouTube description as well. So that in mind, I thank everyone for joining in, and yes, over to Riddhi and Pranav to announce our best speaker as well as the two teams that have qualified, and if they have anything to say. Riddhi.
Pranav, how about you announce the teams and then I'll announce best speaker.
Sure. So are you going ahead first or should I?
You go ahead.
Great. So the team that has, I'll begin with the team that came second and will also be qualifying for the next rounds, according to me. It is, just give me a moment. Yeah, so it is the dialect duos which stands second. The teammates being Gaurav Rampuria and Achintya Nevatia. And following it, the team that stands first today is the team named DPSM, represented by Arth Agarwal and Vidyut Chattopadhyay. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Yes. Apart from that, I do not have anything. I do not have anything much to add about debate today, except that I had expected the proposition to argue more on principles, and also this applies to the opposition and the proposition, because in this kind of a motion, I personally would prefer more of principled arguments than citing cases and citing situations that happen in real life. For example, many of you brought up the examples of the scenario in India and the scenario in America, and while that is perfectly all right, I personally would have preferred there to be more like arguments based on the principle of the motion, the concept, as a few of the speakers in the in the later part of the debate did bring up how they debated on whether or not the concept or the principle of the motion stood or not. But I would have liked more of that line of argument to have been more evident in the debate. Apart from that, I have nothing to add. Riddhi, you can go ahead.
Right. So, with regards to today's debate, I think great effort from everyone's side because it was the first round of the tournament. There's still a long way to go in terms of how you guys frame and structure arguments. Try to structure arguments better. If you're near the end of the debate, then make sure to be more refutative instead of still constructive and defining and arguing on very fundamental aspects. Move beyond that and look into what other people have said to make your stance stronger. Right. I think for me and Pranav both today unanimously, Vidyut is the best speaker. Well done, Vidyut. Your
Thank you.
oratory was great.
Thank you.
We really liked how composed you were while also making very, very strong foundational arguments. That's all from me. Over to you, Suryansh.
Right. Thank you very much, Riddhi, and thank you very much, Pranav. In my own capacity, I think I agree with these results as well. And I congratulate Vidyut as well as your team and your team and as well as Gaurav and Achintya's team of the Dialect Duos. Of course, I would also remind the other participants and the other teams here to remember that this yet although it was a knockout stage and this may be the end of the path for the tournament for you here. I would remind you that although even though you won't be in the tournament any longer, one debate doesn't necessarily define how good you are as a debater. So we will of course be having more friendly rounds laterwards, so I would encourage you to take part in them too. And yes, just because a team qualified, that doesn't mean you as a debater individually are not capable. So I congratulate all of you all of you made some very good speeches. And yeah, other than that, yeah, I request you again to help out Project Suffer in any other way you can. Congratulations to all of you once again. Thank you very much, Riddhi and Pranav, for joining in. I really appreciate you guys coming in and debating with us and judging our debates. So with that in mind, we are wrapping up for today. And yeah, that's what that was.